So just to give you a little history, I'm here this morning representing the Foreign Animal and Zoonotic Disease Defense Center. And basically, we were established in 2004 as the DHS Center for Excellence, and we really worked pretty hard to address the issues of early detection, response, and recovery from a high-consequence foreign animal or zoonotic disease event. And so basically, just what I just said, we're working very hard to protect the nation's agriculture, whether that be by developing new diagnostic tools that I'm going to talk about today, helping lead the nation in determining priorities, or looking at modeling for economic impact for such an outbreak, or whether that's in our education and outreach programs. And just a few of our stakeholders and customers up there, obviously the most important in our industries. And as I mentioned, we just work very hard to protect the agricultural enterprise. And so we work as the DHS Center of Excellence, and as such, we work very closely with the Department of Homeland Security. And we've been talking to them recently about a New Start program that they have that's called Agricultural Screening Tools. And in that program, basically, we were talking about how the Ph.D. Center might be of help in defining the needs and requirements for the agricultural screening tools. And out of that came the obvious need for us to hold some workshops that could address this, but perhaps not only agricultural screening tools, but other high-priority requirements that we're going to be looking at. And so we are in the process as a center of bringing together subject matter experts from the USDA, from the industry, from the Department of Homeland Security, in addressing some critical issues. And the first one that we chose was agricultural screening tools. But down the road, we'll probably look at modeling, vaccines, and some of the other things that we need to address as well as a nation. So, having said that, the Department of Homeland Security does have a New Start program. It's called the Agricultural Screening Tool Program. And so what we needed to do first in helping the DHS determine priorities and gaps was to hold a workshop where we could do this. And actually, we held a series of 2 workshops. The first one we held in November of 2010, and then we just had one last week, which was a follow-on to that. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through the talk. So this New Start program was developed in response to gaps that were identified by the stakeholders to the Department of Homeland Security. And it was identified as part of an interagency process between the different agencies that work on agricultural priorities. And so the challenge for this program is to provide tools that can rapidly identify high-priority ag pathogens. And as you just heard Pam say, we know that we need certain tests for either products or animal movement to ensure business continuity. So the output for this program is intended to be standardized tools and protocols that can be used to help ensure business continuity and resiliency of the industry. So what we're hoping is that through the several years of this program's existence that we can shore up the foundation and the infrastructure to enhance our business continuity practices and give Pam and others that are working on the Secure Milk Plan the tools that they need to build into those plans to ensure that we can permit rapidly and that we can move product and that we can move animals. So you ask why, I mean, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but we all know that the time to detection is directly proportional to the economic consequences of an outbreak. And so we want to make sure that we can detect early, that we have the tools to respond to, and that we can recover from an outbreak. And in all that process, provide the tools that decision makers need to have to rapidly permit movement from the control zone or from premises and rapidly identify the status of premises as we go along. And so just to point this out, one of our principal investigators associated with the center, Tim Carpenter, has recently published a paper that talked about the epidemic and economic impacts of delayed detection of foot and mouth disease. So you guys might want to take a look at that. So we know that we need these screening tools. We know that we have animals on the road at any one given time, and that we have lots of animals on the road, and that we have product that that needs to be moved, whether that's eggs, whether that's milk, and that we need tools available to protect our businesses, our agricultural businesses, and to allow for continued movement. We don't want this to happen, which was in the UK. And in 2001, when they did a retrospective analysis, there was no evidence of Beckham being on 23% of the farm. So we want to avoid this. We want to have the tools in place to avoid this. And so, as I mentioned, the purpose of our workshops was the first workshop basically designed to identify and prioritize what gaps we do have in ag screening tool availability, and then to prioritize those gaps so that we can begin to address them and fill them, and then again provide people with the tools to build into their business continuity plans. And once we identified the gaps in the first workshop, and I'm going to talk about what those are later here, then we wanted to bring back in a second workshop the industry, to get the industry's perspective of how you might build the use of those tools into normal business operations on a daily basis, so not to interrupt the normal flow of business during an outbreak. So the first thing that we did during the first workshop was the first goal was to come to a general consensus about what the definition of an agricultural screening tool is. And while this all seems to be, it should seem easy to understand what an agricultural screening tool is, really getting a general consensus from the subject matter experts was really important, because there are different things, different types of tests. There are tests that you would run in your regional laboratory that will require confirmation at the reference laboratory during an outbreak, and then there are things that we call ag screening tools that you would use to just screen on the farm, but would subsequently require a confirmatory test at the reference laboratory. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what the definition was and what the general consensus was. And then you have to figure out how those tools would be used and who would use them, who would be pulling the sample, and who would be performing the test, and then what the implications of that test would mean. So there were a lot of issues around ag screening tools. And the agricultural community and the national reference laboratories have typically have not put forward the idea of using these types of tools in the field because of all the complexities around who would do them, who would perform the test, what would those results mean, how would they be interpreted, and as Pam pointed out, how do you get all that information back to a central location where someone can actually use it? So there are a lot of questions around the use of these tools and what the actual results of that test would tell you. And so the group had a big challenge in front of us when we sat down for that first meeting. And then we also needed to identify what are the gaps, what tools do we not have. And I think some of those were very, very evident, and Pam already talked about one earlier today. And for the first meeting, we focused on foot and mouth disease because we figured if we got into the other diseases like Rift Valley fever or avian influenza, we wouldn't be able to focus, and we figured that foot and mouth disease could serve as the model for where we would take the rest of the tools we needed for other high priority diseases. So I mentioned, first of all, we needed to come to some sort of definition about what an ag screening tool is. An ag screening tool is just basically a test that can be used, or a tool that can be used to detect potential disease or condition in an animal, a group of animals, or an animal product. And the key here is that it's not meant to be confirmatory in nature. So basically, we want to use these tools on the farm to get an idea of the farm's status. And we're going to talk about the gaps and the possibilities of using the tests that we currently have in this manner here in a few minutes. So recently in our second workshop, we were very fortunate that we had someone from the UK laboratory who had been through this recently with the foot and mouth disease outbreak, obviously in 2007. And they've had much discussion in the UK about the use of pen-side diagnostics or point-of-care diagnostics. And you basically have two options. I mean, you can do the on-site test, the field test, which could be lateral flow devices or mobile PCR. But then those on-site tests need confirmation at either a regional laboratory or at a national reference laboratory. And so I just put that up there to show you that what we're talking about with ag screening tools are basically field testing versus centralized testing. So when the group got down in the first workshop to evaluating what we have, I can personally tell you that, since I am the director of a NOLM laboratory and I helped set up the NOLM lab since 2003, that I believe that since 2003 or 2001, this nation has come a long way toward being prepared for foot and mouth disease outbreak. We've got tests deployed out to our regional labs, and we know that there are 60 some odd labs in 43 states, and most of them are accredited labs. So we have a pretty robust system out there for doing some testing for a high consequence disease outbreak. Most of the things that have been deployed to the National Animal Health Laboratory Network are real-time PCR assays, which can be used during early detection and the response phase of an outbreak. What we are currently lacking are real-time PCR assays for other high-priority diseases such as African swine fever. We are totally lacking serological screening, which will have to be in place for recovery and allow us to regain our trade status back. We have no serological assays that have been deployed out to the laboratory. And as of right now, we don't have a field test, a pen-side point-of-care test that we can use in the field, whether that's to test bulk tank milk or whether that's to test the animals themselves. We do not have this available. There is some work being done on a commercialized test at Plum Island, but right now that test doesn't look like it's sensitive enough to do anything but rule in a farm that has clinical signs. So again, we know that since 2001 we've significantly boosted the nation's preparedness. But we also know, and you just heard Pam say, that in order to support business continuity and movement of animals and animal products, we need better tests, we need more rapid tests, and we probably need field tests, pen-side tests that are highly sensitive. And so, as I mentioned, strong, but we need additional capacity. And what we have done, though, since 2001 is we've built that confirmatory laboratory testing. We've built that tiered testing laboratory that will allow us to support now the use of mobile testing or pen-side testing. So I think that's really important to know as well. So from the first meeting, we came out with several recommendations, and I'm going to go through those recommendations and talk to you a little bit about what they mean. But initially, at least, all the recommendations that came out of this first workshop focus on continuing to strengthen the National Animal Health Laboratory Network's testing capabilities, because that's where the bulk of the samples are going to go during an outbreak situation. And then each new region or each new premise would probably need confirmatory testing at the National Reference Laboratory. So the first recommendation that came out basically was that we need additional sample types validated for use with our real-time PCR assays out into the NOLM. So right now we have those tests validated for just a limited number of matrices, whether that be a swab or whether that be blood. But we need additional sample types validated so that we can test, for instance, for bulk tank samples. And we know that that's a high priority, and as Tam mentioned, that is a priority for the Department of Homeland Security to fund this next year, and hopefully within 2 years we're going to have a test out there. We also know that it would be much easier for the swine industry to collect oral fluids instead of bleeding. So one of the things that we want to do is move toward validating the tests that we currently have with oral fluids, and we also had that same discussion around bovine. We also need to look at pooling of samples. We need to validate the tests that we currently have out in the NOLM with pooled samples to allow us to get a bigger representative of sample types. When you talk about pooling samples, you can look at decreased sensitivity with your assay. So we need to validate the sensitivity of the tests we currently have with pooled samples like they've done with avian influenza. So that's going to be a priority as well. That has not been done. Right now we have to test sample by sample as it comes off the premise. We also, one of the high priorities that came out was serological testing. As I mentioned before, during the recovery phase of an outbreak, we need to have serological testing available in the NOLM laboratories that can differentiate an infected versus a vaccinated animal. And currently, we do not have that out in the NOLM laboratories. So the third recommendation from the group was to get these assays that are commercially available, validated, and deployed out to the National Animal Health Laboratory Network. And that will help us establish freedom of disease if we are in an outbreak. We know that we have the DIVA assay capability has not been deployed out to the NOM right now, but the tests that are commercially available are very, very time consuming, and so we also know that we need better serological assays. So the fourth recommendation was to develop new DIVA assays that can complement the vaccines that are currently being developed and advance the speed with which those tests can be performed. Because this is where we're going to see this is where we're going to start to see the volume of testing come into the laboratory. And during the recovery phase of an outbreak, we're going to have serological testing that needs to be performed. We're also going to have testing to continue to show freedom of disease for antigen testing. So at this point in time, the laboratories are going to be pretty overwhelmed with samples coming through. So we need a rapid test and we need a high throughput test. And then lastly, and this seems to be the topic of the big conversation, would we use pin-side tests and how would we use them? We know that the current pin-side tests that are available, ones that have been tested at the Purebright Laboratory in the UK and are now being tested at Plum Island, are not sensitive enough to rule out an infection on premise. We know that they can be used if you have clinical signs on a premise. You can use them to rapidly rule in the fact that you do have disease on that premise. So right now, that's a real limitation that we have, but we have discussed that how those tests might be used at this point in time. We know that one of the recommendations that came out of this group was to continue to evaluate those tests and then move them forward to develop a policy around how those tests might be used. But we also know that we need to invest in more rapid detection technologies that can be used pin-side so that we can then make more rapid decisions about permitting and movement of animals and products. And so one of the recommendations, again, was to really spend some resources in development of a more sensitive mobile test or point-of-care test. And the complexity that will come around how the pin-side test, again, is going to be the policy of who will do that test, who will collect the sample, how will those test results get reported, and then what does all that mean in the context of permitting and moving. Some additional findings. Basically, I won't read all these to you, but we know that we need to, what Pam talked about earlier, you can have all the testing your heart desires, but if you don't have a way to transmit that data to the incident command or a person making decisions, it won't mean anything. And so we're still struggling very much out in the laboratories on getting that sample accession into our data systems and then transmitting the results of that test to the people who can actually use those results. And so that needs to be an emphasis as we move forward as well. And so one of the other results that came out of the workshop number one was to convene an additional workshop and identify and evaluate novel and emerging technologies that can be used in normal business practices too, and gain the industry perspective on using these tools. So in summary, out of the first workshop, I don't think there were any new revelations that came about to the people that were sitting around the table, but it did help us prioritize where we're going with these tools and what we need to do first in order to ensure that we're meeting the industry's priorities. And as I said before, from the workshop number one, I think we basically identified the fact that the NOM is robust and it's there, but there needs to be additional tools deployed to the NOM in order to shore up the foundation that will help us ensure resiliency within our industries and business continuity practices. And so meeting the objectives for the business continuity plans that Pam talked about will require that additional matrix validation, whether that's milk instead of swabs, oral fluids instead of nasal swabs, evaluation and validating the pooled samples, serological assays. We need more technological developments with our pin sides. And we also need to take a look at dual purpose assays. I think it's clear that some industries are ready to move forward with dual purpose assays where we're testing for endemics and foreign animal diseases in the background on a routine basis. And if you look at the NPIP program with AI, John Zach with emergency programs has mentioned this many times. The testing that we do with the NPI program gives us the background. If we had an AI out outbreak tomorrow, we've got a good surveillance, or a good idea of what's going on in our flocks across the nation within that program. If we can embed some of this testing in our routine daily diagnostics that we're doing, if we did have an outbreak, it would give us the foundation and understanding of the status within our regions across the nation, and that's important. And I think some of the industries are ready to move this way, and some of it's already happening. So after we finished workshop number 2, we all sat around and asked ourselves, okay, well, we have these priorities, but how would these tools be utilized within the industry, and what are the industry perspectives on using these tools, whether they're dual-purpose assays or whether they're pen-side assays? So we wanted to bring the industry folks around the table and have the people around the table get a better understanding of the industry and their normal business practices on a daily basis, and where it would be easier for them to sample and take samples for the lab, and what types of samples. And so we brought the industry around the table, and we talked about business practices on the business practices. We talked about matrices that would be easier for them to collect, and then the policy around the use of those assays. And we just had this last week, so I'm not ready to give you the findings from this workshop. But the goals from the second workshop, as I said before, was to obtain the animal industry input and to complete a policy gap analysis. Because believe it or not, again, you can have all the tools available for testing, but you got to understand what the policy around the use of those tools are. You got to understand who's going to collect the sample, who's going to read the test, and then what does a suspicious test mean. Does that test want to get confirmed at the National Reference Laboratory? What are the implications of a false positive, etc.? And so we sat around the table last week and we discussed many of these things, and hopefully we gained a greater understanding from the industries on their perspectives on the use of ag screening tools and the perspectives of using them in a routine daily surveillance. We had a good outcome from that meeting. We had all the major industries represented. And we discussed policy at length last week about around the use of these assays, whether they would be used to permit movement, etc. We also, again, prioritized, looked at critical areas within the sectors that we could collect samples and what types of samples. We had a very, again, at-length discussion on the use of pen-side technology as it stands today versus where we need to go in order for us to be able to support whether it's fast eggs or secure milk. We discussed the role of the NOM laboratories, and again, who would test and who would collect. I think the major take-home point about all of this was when we ended at 5 o'clock last week, was that, again, we have a very robust system in place with the NOM, but we still have gaps there in order to be able to support the testing requirements during early detection, response, and recovery. We've identified the gaps that need to be filled, and we're going to move to do that. And by shoring up that foundation and that infrastructure, that will then be the support infrastructure on which these other layers of tests, such as the mobile test, the pen-side test, can then be used to ensure movement with enough confidence that those tests can then be backed up with confirmatory testing at the regional or the reference laboratories. So with all of that, I'll close and I'll take any questions, and hopefully some of that made sense. Thank you.